Welcome back, everyone, online and here in the room, to the keynote of this conference, actually, not just of today, but of the conference, which is given by Professor Stephen Harvey. He's a professor in medieval Jewish and Islamic philosophy at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. He's the president of the Commission for Jewish Philosophy of the SIEPM, and he has written well over 100 studies on Jewish and Islamic medieval philosophy. We're most grateful that you're here today, Steve, and are presenting on the place of observation and experience in the quest for true knowledge among Jewish Aristotelians in the 13th and 14th centuries. Let's welcome Steve, everyone.
Well, thank you, Katya. Thank you, Nicola, for inviting me to this eye-opening conference. So far, it's been a delightful experience from which I've learned a lot. 20 years ago, the 10th International Congress of the CPIM was held in Erfurt on the theme, "What is Philosophy in the Middle Ages?" I took the conference theme seriously and saw this as an opportunity to address its seemingly simple-minded question through the eyes of the medieval Islamic and Jewish Aristotelians. My lecture was entitled "The Quiddity of Philosophy According to Averroes and Falkera, a Muslim philosopher and his Jewish interpreter." I would like to summarize briefly parts of this paper because it sketches a picture of philosophy and science a bit different from the one I wish to present today. I began with several general questions, such as, was there a tradition amongst philosophically inclined Muslims and Jews as to what is philosophy or how philosophy is practiced? And was the sense of what it means to engage in philosophy essentially any different for the medieval Muslims or Jews than it was for the ancient Greeks, the later Greek commentators, or the various schools of medieval Christian philosophy? In the paper, I addressed these questions by exploring the meaning of philosophy for the 12th century Islamic philosopher Averroes and for the 13th century Jewish philosopher Shem Tov ibn and de substantia orbis, is the most advanced of those opinions which man, insofar as he is man, may by his own knowledge and intellect attain. In the long commentary on the Anima, he wrote, "I believe that this man was the exemplar which nature found for showing the final human perfection in the material realm." And in the middle commentary of the prior analytics, he added that such a person is not human. That is why the ancients used to call him divine. It would be an exaggeration to say that Averroes accepted everything that Aristotle wrote, and Ruth Glassner has recently illustrated this in her book, Averroes Physics. But few students of Aristotle in the history of philosophy have relied so much on the Stagirite's teaching as he did, and perhaps none has surpassed him in the single-mindedness with which he approached, mastered, and explained the full range of the Aristotelian corpus. It is as if philosophy for Averroes were the study of logic, natural science, and metaphysics, and the contemporary activity of philosophy were the reading and the attempt to understand and explain the writings of Aristotle, the man who said what could be said on all these subjects. Averroes' goal in his commentaries, as he repeatedly states, is simply to teach and explain what he has learned from Aristotle to the extent of our ability and our intelligence. The activity of philosophy for Averroes is thus the study and explication of all that exists, the impassioned pursuit of knowledge and truth. For Averroes, it was an activity that could best be performed through the careful study and explication of the writings of Aristotle. This view of the philosophy and science may be found centuries earlier in Al-Farabi, the founder of the school of Islamic Aristotelianism. Al-Farabi wrote in a section on the origin of the syllogistic arts in his Book of Letters, section's already been referred to today, in the Book of Letters, arguably his most mature philosophical work. Then all this, that is, the proper methods of inquiry and whether certainty may be achieved through any of them, will be debated until the affair ends up as it ended up in the days of Aristotle. Scientific inquiry will then culminate in distinguishing all of the methods, and theoretical as well as general practical philosophy will be perfected, with no room left in them for investigation. Hence, philosophy will become an art that is only learned and taught. It will be taught through one sort of instruction for the elect and another sort of instruction that is common and for all. The instruction for the elect will be by demonstrative methods only, while the common instruction, which is for everyone, will be dialectical, rhetorical, or poetical methods. In other words, for Al-Farabi, since philosophy and science were perfected by Aristotle, all that remains for the modern-day philosopher is to study Aristotle's works and teach them to others. Now, these assessments of Aristotle and his achievements by both Al-Farabi and Averroes are cited by Shem Tov Falakera, perhaps the 13th century Jewish thinker most learned in the Islamic philosopher, in the introduction to his Hebrew Encyclopedia of Science, The Opinions of the Philosophers. These assessments are further supported by Falakera with other quotations to the effect that all that needs to be known can be found in the works of Aristotle. For example, Falakera cites Maimonides' high praise of Aristotle and his famous statement in the Guide of the Perplexed 222 that everything that Aristotle has said about all that exists from beneath the sphere of the moon to the center of the earth is indubitably correct, and no one will deviate from it unless he does not understand it, he wishes to defend, or that lead him to a denial of a thing that is manifest. Interestingly, having made this case, Falakera cautions the reader that all these scholars have exaggerated concerning Aristotle's perfection, and that the truth is rather with Alexander of Aphrodisias, who said that Aristotle's opinions are less doubtful than those of others. Nonetheless, Falakera tells us that his book is not original, for he simply gathers and translates the words of Aristotle as explained through the commentaries of Averroes, who is the last of the commentators and who took what was best from the other ones. Falakera goes a step beyond Aristotle in understanding. Falakera goes a step beyond Averroes in understanding the present-day task of the philosopher and scientist. Not only has what needs to be known already been written down, but has already been explained. The task of the philosopher has thus been simplified to studying the explanations and making them accessible to qualified readers. For Falakera, this meant reorganizing and condensing the Averroian commentaries. This need for concision, as well as the importance Falakera himself attached to the book, are conveyed by him in an extraordinary analogy. Just as a person in whose house a fire has broken out on the Sabbath will save only what is necessary, so Falakera tells us he will abstract from the works of the philosophers only what is necessary for human perfection. This was for him the pressing task of the philosopher. I concluded my paper on the nature of philosophy in the Middle Ages for leading Islamic and Jewish philosophers with some hesitancy to generalize, but this much I claimed seems certain. The activity of philosophy comprised the study, explanation, interpretation, and at times development of the truths that were found in the great scientific texts that were available. Medieval philosophy, like the present-day study of it, seemed to be a very bookish enterprise. Now we can fast forward to the present and our most enjoyable conference on translating experience, and now you can understand my thinking when I wrote the first paragraph of my abstract. Jewish Aristotelians of the 13th and 14th centuries following their two philosophical authorities, Maimonides and Averroes, saw truth in human perfection through the orderly study of Aristotle's books on logic, natural science, and metaphysics, as they were paraphrased and explained by Averroes. Averroes saw his task as the careful study and explication of Aristotle's writings. Jewish thinkers, in turn, expressed their intentions to convey, explain, simplify, and even on occasion critique Averroes' commentaries on Aristotle. But did these thinkers really do as they wrote? And in any case, was pure bookish learning and demonstrative reasoning sufficient for leading one to true knowledge and perfection? The truth of the matter is that until my discussion with Katya, that began last July in Berlin, I gave little thought to the place of observation and experience in medieval Jewish, or for that matter, Islamic philosophy. Actually, I should say conscious thought, because it seems that unawares I have over the years compiled in my mind a list of examples of the role of observation, oral reports, and experience for late medieval Jewish thinkers in the study of physics, astronomy, meteorology, medicine, dreams, and prophecy. It is this hitherto latent list that will provide the illustrations for the core of my paper. I will begin with some comments on Maimonides, one of the first and most famous of the Jewish Aristotelians, who died in 1204 at the outset of the 13th century. So I can technically include him in my comments about 13th and 14th century thinkers. The term tajriba, experience, appears in only one passage in Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed. The passage occurs in Part 2, Chapter 37, in the context of Maimonides' explanation of the reasons for the commandments, and in particular his claim that certain practices were prohibited because of idolatry. Thus, in order to keep people from idolatry, many commandments prohibited observing usages of the idolaters, including agricultural activities. But Maimonides quotes the Talmudic ruling that practices of the idolaters that pertain to medicine are not idolatry and may be done. Maimonides explained, you must not consider as a difficulty certain things the rabbis have permitted, as for instance, the nail of one who is crucified and a fox's tooth. For in those times, these things were considered to derive from experience and accordingly pertained to medicine and entered into the same class as the hanging of a peony upon an epileptic and the giving of a dog's excrements in cases of the swelling of the throat. For it is allowed to use these remedies, similar to these, that experience has shown, here's the tajriba, to be valid, even if reasoning does not require them. For they pertain to medicine, and their efficacy may be ranged together with the purgative action of aperient medicines. Maimonides distinguishes here between experience, tajriba, and reasoning, qiyas. There are medical remedies that we know work not from reason, but from experience. When experience supports these often rather odd remedies, we can employ them, even though they are practiced by the idolaters and reason does not require them. The rabbis allowed their use because they work and can save lives. In such cases that pertain to medicine, the odd practices are considered medicine, not idolatry. Most noteworthy in Maimonides' medical writings on this subject is his recognition of the importance of experimentation and observation in medicine, but that these findings must be subject to the requirements of theoretical inquiry. Another. Toward the very end of his medical aphorisms, Maimonides writes that if any man tells you that he has witnessed things and perceived them with the senses, and this man is exceedingly trustworthy and just, reflect upon his words, reflect upon them, and do not accept them until you have examined them in accordance with the requirements of theoretical inquiry. Elsewhere, he argues explicitly against empiricist physicians who rely completely on experience and are ignorant of and do not apply reasoning, kias, and points out the risks of trusting them. For our purposes, what is relevant about Maimonides is that he emphasizes the importance of experience and observation for medicine in his various medical writings. His own curiosity or thirst for medical knowledge repeatedly takes him from his medical text to learning or verifying via experience and observation. For example, Avicenna mentions a recipe for a pancake for strengthening sexual desire. Maimonides, as a learned physician, could have just passed this odd recipe on with other ones to his hopeful patient. But instead, as he tells us in his treatise on coitus, he prepared the concoction himself, although he simplified it and seems to have offered a kosher version of it, and gave it to his patient, who happily reported that it had a great and most desired effect on him. Although this was hardly what we would call today a scientific control, as Avicenna recommended drinking strong wine with a nice aroma after eating the pancake, in any case, we cannot be sure which ingredients were vital to the effect. Maimonides made sure the concoction was prepared properly and then sought to discover if it really works. Actually, for Maimonides, experience was crucial for testing the efficacy of all medicines and treatments. He repeatedly asked leading physicians about various medications and treatments and the success they observed with them. Often he will mention a treatment and add that I too have tested it and found it is of benefit, or I have tested it several times and saw that it is very effective. He concludes his regimen of the health with information on the great special property of the wild ass in strengthening vision. In the medical aphorisms, he cites Ibn Zur, his most trusted authority for the reliability of drugs, to the effect that staring in the eyes of a wild ass gives lasting, healthy vision. Here, he repeats his advice, but also states that eating its flesh and holding one's eyes over the vapor of its cooking meat really strengthens vision. This, he tells us, has been verified by experience. Maimonides fully appreciated the great importance of observation and experience for medical knowledge. While experience without reasoning was not sufficient, neither was reasoning without experience. He himself was constantly testing drugs and treatments and sought out senior physicians to learn from their experiences with various treatments. But did experience for Maimonides have epistemological relevance outside of medicine? I am not sure, but I think not. Let us now briefly consider the three major 13th-century Hebrew encyclopedists of science and philosophy. I've already discussed the most learned of them, Shem Tov ibn Falkera and his encyclopedia, The Opinions of the Philosophers. I concluded that for him, the task of the philosopher, after Aristotle the philosopher and after Averroes the explicator and grand commentator, is simply to study the explanations of Averroes and make them accessible to qualified readers. For Falkera, as we have seen, this meant reorganizing, condensing, and blending together Averroian commentaries and translating the whole into Hebrew. It was purely bookish learning. Is this picture accurate for the other encyclopedists? Consider the first of the 13th century Hebrew encyclopedists, Judah ben Solomon Cohen, the author of the Midrash HaChochmah. Here I rely on Rezian Fontaine, who has spent the past 20 years studying this encyclopedia and is the recognized expert on it. In brief, this long and wide-ranging encyclopedia relies on much abridged citations from Averroes' short and middle commentaries for his treatment of natural science. Fontaine explains that Judah invested considerable effort in making scientific knowledge more accessible to his readers, and that he followed a strictly orthodox Aristotelian concept of scientific method. She then adds, given the scientific bias, it will come as no surprise that Judah hardly ever supplements the scientific material with personal observations or with information derived from oral communications. In her studies, she has provided a few examples of these rare personal interventions. One such example appears in a discussion based on Averroes' commentary on Aristotle's De Animalibus on the question of the nature of the female contribution to generation. Judah questions the role of menstrual blood in generation. He brings his own personal knowledge or observations to inform us of a certain Dorcati family whose women do not have menstrual blood, but nonetheless give birth. This would suggest that menstrual blood plays no part in generation. But Judah then explains that these women do in fact have menstrual blood, but that the blood somehow never leaves their bodies. The third and last encyclopedist I will mention is Gershom ben Salomon, the author of Shar HaShamayim, the last and by far the most popular of the great Hebrew encyclopedias. Unlike Falak of the 13th century, unlike Falakera and Judah, Gershom did not know Arabic, was reliant on Hebrew translations, and did not make much use of Averroes' commentaries. Gershom was much more interested in observation, experience, and personal reports. James Robinson provides references for several of these in his study of Gershom's encyclopedia, many of which were learned from shepherds, hunters, fishermen, farmers, and physicians. Here we encounter, for example, a man in his city who found the stone that Gershom had been studying and trying to describe in a small fish. A woman, an Arl, who gave birth to 9 children at a single time, who were called by the townspeople pigs, because pigs also give birth to many children at once. And the eyewitness account of one of the seekers of wisdom about a man who was decapitated and yet walked a certain distance before he collapsed. And on the other hand, the account of a fellow Jew who once witnessed the heart taken out of a chicken and the chickens jumping up and down for a long time, presumably not from happiness. This distinction, I mean the great interest in particulars and personal observations between Gershom on the one hand and Judah and Falakera on the other, has been considered by Mauro Zonta, whose 1996 study, Mineralogy, Botany, and Zoology in the Medieval Hebrew Encyclopedias, remains the standard survey in the field. Zonta views the difference as one of method or approach that is theoretical and descriptive, and he discusses the works on natural sciences against the background of Albertus Magnus. Zonta shows that Judah and Falakera are interested almost exclusively in the theoretical or philosophical approach, with some slight interest in descriptive accounts, which are drawn from earlier works. Gershom is also interested in the theoretical approach, but fills his encyclopedia, which is mostly devoted to the natural sciences, with descriptions as well. Zonta explains that Gershom's aim for popularity urged him to insert long descriptive sections in his encyclopedia. In discussing Gershom's zoology in particular, Zonta writes that because Gershom aimed to satisfy the curiosity of the common reader, his discussion is full of references to phenomena concerning animals. Here I must emphasize that descriptive here does not suggest a new approach to science or special interest in experience. Most of Gershom's descriptive material come from his sources, Hebrew translations of Greek and Arabic writings, and other texts. Although, as we have seen from Robinson, there are many interesting additions that come from personal observations and in particular oral reports. Gershom was in no way like Albertus, and we find nothing like Albertus's indefatigable scientific curiosity. For example, to know the number of eggs and chicks in the eagle's nest, which he learned by visiting the nest of a certain eagle for 6 straight years, which he acquired through first-hand experience only by being lowered from the cliff on a rope of exceedingly great length. But then, I cannot think of any medieval Hebrew natural scientist quite like Albertus. This is not to say that the Hebrew encyclopedias did not appreciate the importance of encyclopedian of experience and observation. It is rather that they did not see this as their task. Falakera, in his account of dreams, which basically translates parts of Averroes' discussion in his epitome of the Parva Naturalia, interrupts his account with a short statement from Avicenna, or rather pseudo-Avicenna, as Falacera no doubt suspected, to the effect that according to what's attributed to Avicenna, dream images do not come from a divine source. The proof for this comes from experience. We see some irrational animals who dream, like dogs, whom we see barking while asleep. The barking is a proof concerning the dream, and this proof is that the dream does not have a divine cause. For if it had a divine cause, it is absurd that irrational animals would dream. Pseudo-Avicenna's proof comes from experience. We see dogs barking in their sleep. Now, this example does not originate in Falacera or pseudo-Avicenna, but in Aristotle himself, in a text not available in Arabic, that insofar as certain of the other animals also dream, writes Aristotle, it may be concluded that dreams are not sent by God. Pseudo-Avicenna, relying on his own experience perhaps, or someone else's, speaks of dogs barking in their sleep. Falacera cites pseudo-Avicenna, but does not make any effort to test the claim. Rather, Falacera adds the following words, and thereby solves the problem. If he is right that irrational animals dream, then it is as the rabbis of blessed memory said, there is no difficulty. In the one case, it is through an angel, and in the other case, through a demon. In other words, pseudo-Avicenna's argument is hardly a proof for Falacera. A few decades later, Gershom employs the same passage in pseudo-Avicenna in the same context, but favorably. We know dogs dream because they bark in their sleep. Since dogs have no intellect, and intellect is required to receive divine knowledge, dreams do not have a divine origin. I now turn to medieval Judaism's greatest and most original scientist, Gersonides. This Provençal scholar was also the leading Jewish philosopher and biblical exegete of the 14th century. Michael Schenck calls him the most creative astronomer of 14th century Europe. His broad grasp of Aristotelian logic and science has long been appreciated by scholars in the field, although the careful study of his many super commentaries and Averroes commentaries, a genre he pioneered, including editions of these texts, has only been carried out in earnest in the past decades. Here, special mention again must be made of Ruth Glassner, the leading scholar of medieval Jewish natural science today, and her well-documented studies on Gersonides' physical theory and its relation to that of Aristotle and Averroes. Gersonides was a learned student of Averroes, but he was also original and critical. A little less than 2 years ago, Glassner's book on Gersonides appeared and put forth a somewhat different picture of him. She skillfully traces his intellectual biography and concludes that growing skepticism led him to abandon the search for truth in natural science and instead devote virtually all his energies to observation and mathematical calculation in his attempt to solve problems associated with astronomy. In other words, only observation and mathematical calculation, repeatedly refined, could lead to scientific knowledge. And Gersonides began to feel the responsibility that it was up to him to spend whatever time he had left in his life to create the scientific instruments and make and remake the observations and calculations until the elusive knowledge could be acquired. Whether or not Glassner is correct, and I am not fully convinced that he indeed abandoned the search for truth in natural science, what emerges is a scholar fully appreciative of the role of observation and experience in the quest for scientific knowledge. This picture emerges as well in Ahuva Gaziel's recent study of methodology put forward by Averroes and Gersonides for the proper study of zoology. Gersonides argues that the division of animals cannot be done on the basis of rational reasoning alone, but must involve sense perception. One must perceive the forms or materials of the animals to be divided, and this cannot be done unless those animals are observed by the senses. Sense perception is indispensable in any attempt to systematize the animal kingdom, and this systemization cannot be accomplished purely theoretically. While Averroes claimed that for Aristotle the two basic methods of scientific inquiry were sense perception and rational reasoning, Gersonides put the emphasis on the role of sense perception. For Gersonides, the starting point for Aristotle was accumulating data through an empirical process. This could be done through one's own sensory experience or that of his predecessors. Averroes had also emphasized the need to rely on one's predecessors. For example, in the case of exotic animals such as the elephant, or maybe he should have said the rhinoceros. Thus, any comprehensive taxonomy of animals will require at first information acquired by the senses, which can be achieved only over time and after extensive travel to examine the animals in their natural habitats. Following Averroes, Gersonides held the study of zoology requires an integrated technique using empirical information together with systematic, rational organization. Gaziel explains that Gersonides' understanding displays great similarity to his reflections on scientific discovery, apropos his own astronomical practice. His astronomical training and experience allowed him to grasp fundamental elements of scientific practice. For Gaziel, Gersonides' realistic perception of scientific practice as jockeying back and forth between observation and reflection was influenced by his own astronomical research. But in his short commentary on Averroes' De Animalibus, we see little effort at personal observation and experience. While such observation was indeed necessary, it could often be done by one's predecessors and found in earlier books. Curiously, the same Gersonides maintained that experience, nissayon, testifies to the fact that the future can be foretold in dreams and in prophecy. Gersonides argued against Averroes' claim in his Epitome of the Parva Naturalia that there is no communication in dreams or divinations with respect to chance events, with the simple claim that this is contrary to what sense experience testifies. And indeed, we ourselves have had such communications many times in dreams, and this has occurred to others according to what we have heard from them. It is not proper to deny sense experience. Rather, we must determine how this knowledge of chance events occurs. Gersonides also argues against Averroes' view that knowledge of theoretical matters cannot be communicated in dreams. Part of his argument is that this phenomenon happened to him frequently, especially when we have been preoccupied with very profound theoretical matters. It seems that in our dreams, we are asked about such knowledge, and we reply with true answers, although we have never considered these specific dreams previously. I used to try that for exams in high school, and it didn't work. He also suggested that at times, the cures of men are determined by the heavenly bodies through dreams, as well as the strong desire of some sick people to strive to cure themselves, not knowing that this desire comes from the heavenly bodies. He supports this claim with two stories, one of a woman who saw a herb in a garden she had never seen before and had a strong desire to put it on a wound on her leg. She did so and was completely cured. Gersonides adds that the exact same thing happened to his brother when he was small. The other report concerned a very ill man who saw a snake in a pot of his. He was cooking and had an inexplicable urge to eat from that pot. He crawled on his hands and knees, because he was pretty ill, to the pot and ate from the food in it. The food pushed the poisonous liquid that was making him ill to one part of his body, and he was completely cured. As for the question of whether there are some people who are able to foretell the future, Gersonides brings proof from experience. A boy of his day who repeatedly had true prophetic visions and his own personal acquaintance with from his experience, a boy of his who repeatedly had true prophetic visions, and once again his own personal acquaintance with true dreams in a waking state, precognitive visions that communicate knowledge regarding events that occur only immediately afterwards. These experiences and observations provide knowledge, but Gersonides is quick to add, we will try as best as we can to determine the causes of such phenomena, for human perfection is achieved in the pursuit of knowledge of those things that can be known to us. Ḥasdai Crescas, pious rabbi of Barcelona and Saragossa, died in the year 1410, leader of Aragonese Jewry and learned critic of Averroes Aristotelian physics, is known for his bold pioneering concepts of time, space, actual infinity, and the void, which helped pave the way for the overthrow of Aristotelian natural science. Did Crescas, in his revolutionary critique of Aristotelian physics, use observation to reject some of Aristotle's fundamental scientific teachings? This question is discussed by Harry A. Wolfson in his masterful study, Crescas's Critique of Aristotle, and my comments are based on his analysis. Wolfson shows that Crescas at times turned to empirical observation for help. For example, in his refutation of Maimonides' first proposition that existence of any infinite magnitude is impossible, he explicitly turns to observation to prove that motion is possible in an infinite body. In his refutation, arguments for Maimonides' ninth proposition that every body that moves another body moves that other body only by itself being moved at the time it moves the other, Crescas explains that the truth is that iron possesses a natural tendency toward the magnet, which we can only know through sense perception, sense observation. Crescas's student, Joseph Albo, later wrote, even though it cannot be demonstrated by reason, but is warranted by experience. Yet Wolfson explains that experience as a guide to knowledge was to him still a new and untried venture. While forced to turn to its aid occasionally by his own skepticism and as to the validity of speculative reasoning, he knew not what use to make of it, writes Wolfson, and what its far-reaching possibilities were, and unlike the two Bacons, did not attempt to build on it a new method of science. Wolfson may very well have been right about Crescas, but Crescas's student, Joseph Albo, whom I've just mentioned in passing, seems to have understood the value of experience. In his popular theological philosophical book of Roots, which seeks to investigate the roots of divine law, Albo inserts a chapter on methodology. Every science must make use of principles and premises, which are assumed as true and taken from another science. Where does divine law, the Torah, take its principles? Albo explains that things known by experience, nissayon, are known without proof and may be used as principles in demonstration. His example, taken from Crescas and used elsewhere by him, is that it can never be that a magnet should not draw iron, though the cause is not known or understood. For a thing to which experience testifies cannot be other than it is. Albo's answer to his question is that God in his wisdom indicated the truth of the principles of the Torah by experience. Like the property of the magnet in attracting iron, it is not subject to doubt, though its causes be unknown. In the same way as there is no doubt concerning natural things observed by the senses whose causes are known. Albo, in the early 1400s, thus appreciated the value of experience for natural science as well as for establishing theoretically principles of the Torah, such as the immortality of the soul from the Torah and resurrection of the dead. With regard to the latter, he explained, a thing to which experience testifies must be believed, even if it is not required by logical reasoning, hekesh. And again, Albo brings in the magnet to make his point scientifically. But the curious thing is that Albo's examples of experience are not contemporary or from his own experience, but from experiences recorded in Scripture. My aim in this paper was to examine the place of observation and experience in the quest for true knowledge among Jewish Aristotelians in the 13th and 14th centuries. In particular, I wondered whether pure bookish learning and demonstrative reading were considered sufficient for leading one to true knowledge and perfection. My much respected colleague and friend at Bar-Ilan University, Tzvi Langerman, in his recent learned and wide-ranging survey of science in medieval Jewish communities in the Cambridge History of Science, made virtually no mention of experience and observation, with the main exception of a few words on Gersonides as an astronomer, who he informs us was one of a handful of astronomers to make use of his own observations in his theoretical work. While we have seen indications of a gradual appreciation for new observations and experiences in the quest for scientific knowledge, they are few and far between. Maimonides' personal passion for testing medical treatments and medications, and Gersonides' near obsession with seeking more and more accurate astronomical observations and calculations appear to be the closest the medieval Jews got to the empirical scientific methodology of Albertus. These are, as we have seen, signs that a new appreciation for experience was about to emerge among Jewish scholars at the beginning of the 15th century. But Jewish philosophy in the medieval period was essentially a discipline of bookish learning.